Modern Chinese Stories and Novellas from 1999 to 1949. Edited by Joseph S.M. Lau, T Hsia, and Leo Ufan Li. Jiao Shi, 1901 to 1931. On February 7, 1931, 5 young communist writers, Jiao Shi, Hu Yeping, Fang Kang, Li Wei-sun, and Yin Fu, along with 18 other party members, were executed in Longhua, Jiangsu, on charges of conspiracy against the nationalist government. Though they were all writers of small talent, they have been assured posthumous honor in Chinese Communist literary history as the 5 martyrs. The real story of the betrayal of these 23 by their comrades is fascinatingly told in T Hsia's The Gate of Darkness, Seattle, 1968, which also discusses the personalities and literary works of the 5 minor authors. The oldest of the 5, Jiao Shi, pen name Jiao Pingfu, was a native of Ningkai, Kekiang. Under the guidance of 2 teachers of the first normal school in Huangqiao, the famous writers Chu Ziqing and Ye Xiaoquan, he showed an early interest in literature and wrote a number of poems as a member of the Morning Light Society. Upon graduation in 1923, he taught in primary school for 2 years and then went to Peking, where he attended classes at the National Peking University as an unregistered student. In 1926, after less than a year's stay in the capital, however, he had to resume his career as a teacher in his hometown to provide for his family. He was promoted to Director of Education in Ninghai the following year, but as a consequence of his increasing involvement in radical politics, he lost his position in 1928 and fled to Shanghai. While in Shanghai, Jiao Shi renewed his acquaintance with Lu Sun, whose lectures he attended in Peking. The senior writer took a parental interest in the youth and entrusted him to various editorial duties in connection with his magazines. In 1930, Jiao Shi joined the Communist Party as well as the League of Left-Wing Writers, not knowing that his political and literary career would soon be terminated. Almost identical in content, Jiao Shi selected works and Fiction by Jiao Shi, a selection, exclude all his translations and the bulk of his creative writings. The 2 major items preserved therein an autobiographical novel titled February, and the story chosen for this volume, A Slave Mother. The latter especially shows our author at his best as a writer of sobriety and restraint who maintains a plain, flawless style even when telling a shocking story, and has deservedly become a favorite piece for anthologists in China and abroad. A Slave Mother, translated by Jane Parrish Young. Her husband was a fur trader who collected furs and cowhides from hunters in the country and sold them to a larger seaport. Sometimes he also did a little farm work in mid-June, helping others transplant rice seedlings. He could plan each row in a very straight line. If there were 5 workers in a rice paddy, he'd be the one to stand in lead position and set the standard. Still, his financial situation was never good. Debts piled up year after year, and so he began to smoke, drink, and gamble. He turned into a cruel and violent man, and became even poorer. People wouldn't agree to lend him even the smallest amount of money. After an illness, his whole body became a withered, sallow color, his face as amber as a brass drum. Even the whites of his eyes turned yellow. People said he had jaundice. The children all called him Yellow Fatty. One day he said to his wife, "There's no other way out. If things continue like this, we'll have to sell even the small frying pan. I've been thinking. I should find some way to make use of you. What is good for you to starve along with me?" "Make use of me," she stammered in a low voice. His wife was sitting behind the stove, holding her son to her breast. The child had just turned 3, but was still nursing. Yes, her husband's voice had been listless since his illness. I have already pawned you. What? His wife nearly fainted. The room became still for a moment. He wheezed. 3 days ago, Yang the wolf came here and spent half the day trying to get his loan back. I left with him and walked down to the 9 acres pond. I said I didn't want to live anymore. I just sat under the tree, the one you can climb up and one can leap off into the pond. I thought about it, but I didn't have the energy to do it. An owl was hooting into my ear. It took away all my courage, and I got up and returned home. But on the way back, I ran into old Granny Shen. She asked me, "What are you doing out so late?" I told her, and asked her to lend me some money, or at least get a girl in someone's family to lend me some clothes or jewelry to pawn for a while. Otherwise, Yang the wolf's green, wolfish eyes would be gleaming in my house every day. But she just smiled. "What are you still keeping your wife for at home? Look at yourself. You're so sick and shrunken too." I stood in front of her with my head down, not saying anything. She said, "And you only have one son. Of course you can't give him up, but your wife?" I thought then, can it be that she wants me to sell my wife? And she continued, "But your wife, although she's your former wife, when you're poor, it can't be helped. What are you keeping her at home for?" Then she spoke right out. "There is this T. He's already 50, but doesn't have a son and wants to buy a concubine. His first wife won't let him and will only allow him to get a loan for a few years. He told me to look out for a likely person about 30 who's raised 2 or 3 sons, honest, quiet type, willing to work and be submissive to his first wife. This time, it was the wheat-sized wife who asked me, if I could find someone who fit those conditions, they'd be willing to put up $80 to $100. I've been looking around for such a woman for a long time, but I haven't found anyone." She said since she ran into me just then, she started to think about you. Everything about you fits the description. She asked me my opinion. I cried, but she pressed me, and I agreed. He hung his head, his voice feeble, then abruptly stopped. His wife was simply stunned. She couldn't say a word. After some moments in silence, he continued. "Yesterday, old Granny Shen went to the wheat-sized house. She said he and his wife were most satisfied. The price was $100 for a period of 5 years, unless you can produce a son in 3. Old Granny Shen also decided on a date, the 18th of this month, 5 days from now. Today she went to go get the written agreement." By this time, his wife was trembling all over. She gasped, "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" "I was just pacing the floor before you all day and yesterday, but just couldn't bring myself to tell you. But after giving it some thought, I realized that unless I use you as a way out, there is no way out. It's final then." Her teeth chattered. "Everything except the contract. What rotten luck. There's really no other way out?" Chun Pao's dad? Chun Pao was the name of the child in her arms. Rotten luck indeed. I thought so too. We're poor, but if we don't want to die, what else can we do? This year I don't think I can even plant rice seedlings. Have you given any thought to Chun Pao? He's only 4 years old. How can he do without a mother? I'll take care of him. He's weaned. He seemed to be getting angry and walked outside. She began to cry. She remembered back to what happened exactly a year ago. She had given birth to a girl. She had lay on the bed as if she were dead. In death, however, she would have at least been whole. But her limbs and body seemed ripped apart. The newly born girl lay on a pile of dry grass on the floor, crying in a loud voice, her feet drawn in, hands wrapped in tight fists. The umbilical cord was wrapped around her body, and the placenta was fallen to one side. She wanted to gather her strength to get up and wash her, but she had raised her head. Her body was still frozen to the bed. She saw her husband, this cruel, hard man, face beet red, carrying a bucket of boiling water over to the little girl. She had used every last strength she could muster to scream at him, "Wait, wait!" But this man, who had been cruel even before he got sick, wouldn't allow her a moment's discussion. Without a word in reply, he picked up the loudly screaming little girl, this newborn life, in his coarse hands. Like a butcher holding a lamb to be slaughtered, he tossed her in the boiling water. Besides the sound of water splashing and the hissing of boiling water as it touched her skin, there was no sound. She wondered, why didn't the child scream out? Was the girl willing to be wrongly put to death without so much as a cry of protest? She realized now it was because she had fainted then. She had fainted away as if her heart had been gored out. As she thought back over it, her tears finally dried. Oh, this wretched life, she sighed softly. Chung Pao stopped sucking her nipple, looked up at his mother's face, and cried, "Mama, Mama!" The night before her departure, she was close to the darkest corner of the house to sit in. An oil lamp was lit in front of the stove, the light flickering like a firefly. She held Chung Pao in her arms, her head pressed against his hair. Her thoughts seemed to have drifted away, but she couldn't be sure where. Then slowly they returned, back to the field of her vision, back to her child. She whispered to him softly, "Chung Pao, my precious." "Mama," the child gurgled, still sucking her nipple. "Mama has to leave tomorrow." "Eh?" The child didn't seem to understand, but instinctively buried his head in her breast. "Mama won't be coming back, not for 3 years." She wiped her eyes. The child stopped sucking and asked, "Where is Mama going? To the temple?" "No, 30 li away from here, to a family named Li." "I want to go too." "Chung Pao, you can't go." The child protested and suckled a little milk. "You stay home with Papa. Papa will take care of you. He will sleep with you and take you out to play. Now you have to be a good boy and listen to what Papa tells you. In 3 years..." She didn't finish. The child, on the verge of tears, said, "Papa will hit me." "Papa won't hit you anymore." She stroked the child's right temple with her left hand. His father had struck him there with the handle of a hoe 3 days after he killed the newborn baby girl. The wound, once swollen, was now more or less healed. She seemed to have more to say to the child, but her husband came into the door. He walked over to her, hand in his pocket, and pulled out something, saying, "I've already got $70 of it. They'll pay the other 30 in 10 days after you get there." After a pause, he added, "They agreed to send the sedan chair." After a long pause, he continued, "They promised to feed the carriers breakfast before sending them over in the morning." After that, he walked away from her and went inside. That evening, she and her husband didn't eat supper. The next day, the spring rains fell. The sedan chair would arrive early, but she didn't sleep at all last night. She mended a few articles of clothing Chung Pao had. Spring was almost over, and summer soon to come. But she even took out his rugged, padded jacket that he had worn in winter, intending to give it to her husband. The man, though, had already gone to bed. He sat by his side, thinking of something to say to him, but as the long night slipped away, not a word was said. When she had gotten up her courage to call him a few times, she mumbled something indistinctly, the sound beyond his hearing. Then she gave up and lay down to sleep. Just when her thoughts had quieted down, she was about to fall asleep. Chung Pao woke. He poked her, calling, "Mama, I want to get up." While dressing him, she said, "Chung Pao, you be a good at home. Don't cry or your father will hit you. From now on, Mama will always buy you candy and bring home to give you, so don't cry." The young child did not know what grief was. He opened his mouth and began to sing. She kissed him and said, "Don't sing now. You'll wake up Papa." The sedan carriers sat on stools by the door, talking amongst themselves. After a moment, old Granny Shen from the neighboring village arrived. The shrewd old matchmaker entered the house and, brushing raindrops from her clothes, announced, "It's raining. It's a good omen that your family will flourish from now on." The old lady bustled around the room, then sidled up to the child's father. She was trying to get payment for her trouble. since it was through her efforts that he was offered such a favorable contract. To tell the truth, father of Chung Pao, with another $50, the old man could have bought a concubine, she said. She turned around to hurry the woman. The woman was holding Chung Pao, sitting there with no intention of moving. The old lady raised her voice. The sedan carriers have to make it home for lunch. Hurry up and get ready. But the woman just looked at her, as if to say, I don't want to go. Let me stay here and starve. The words were stuck in her throat, but the old lady understood them. She walked up to her, smiling broadly. You're really a naive woman. What can Yellow Fatty give you? These people over there have more food than they can eat, more than 200 mu of land. They are well off. The house is theirs. They have hired hands to raise cattle. Tan Yang has a good temperament. She's very polite to others. Whenever she sees someone, she gives that person food to eat. The old man really, he's not so old. He has fair complexion, no beard. Because he reads so much, his back's a little hunched. But he's a gentle person. There's really no need for me to tell you. You'll see yourself and you'll know that I'm not making up anything. The woman dried her tears and almost to herself said, Chung Pao, how can I leave him like this? Don't worry about him. The old lady put a hand on her shoulder, moving her face close to them. He's already 4 years old. As the old saying goes, a child of 3 from the mother's free. He can live without you. If you're lucky and raise a son or 2 for the man over there, then everything will be fine. The sedan carriers outside were calling out that they had to be on their way, jabbering, She's not a bride. What's all the crying about? The old woman pulled Chung Pao out of her hand, saying, Let me take care of Chung Pao. The little child cried and thrashed about, but the old woman finally got him outside the door. As the woman entered the sedan chair, she turned towards her husband and the old woman. Take the boy inside. It's raining. Her husband, his head propped in his hand, sat motionless and silent. The 2 villages were 30 li apart, but the second time the sedan chair was set down, they were there. The light spring rain blew the covered sedan chair and wet her clothes. A woman in her early 50s with a plump face and crafty eyes came to greet her. She thought, This must be Ta Nyang, but she only gazed at her in some embarrassment without greeting the elderly lady, who cordially helped her onto the steps. A rotund man with a long, thin face appeared. He looked her over carefully. Then, face wreathed in smiles, he asked, Here so early? Your clothes got all wet. The old woman, as if she hadn't heard what he just said, asked, Is there anything else inside? No, the young woman replied. Several women from the neighborhood stood outside the gate and peeked in after they had gone inside. She didn't know why, but her mind was on her own home, and she couldn't stop thinking about Chung Pao. Obviously, she could be happy for the beginning of the 3 years she was to spend there. This household, and the husband who had obtained her on loan, were so much better than her own, and the Sutsai turned out to be as friendly as he said to be. He spoke in such a soft voice. Even Tan Yang was not what she had imagined. She was attentive and friendly in her discourse, speaking of her life and her husband. From the beginning of their happy marriage, 30 years ago now. She had been pregnant once, 15 or 16 years ago, and gave birth to a son. According to her, he was beautiful and an intelligent child, but died of smallpox before he was 10 months old. She hadn't had another child. The old woman implied that she wanted her husband to take a concubine, but somehow this never materialized. Perhaps it was because he cared for her too much to take another woman, or a suitable one was not available. Anyway, Tan Yang was not clear on this point, and the situation had remained unchanged until now. What was made clear was that Tan Yang's speech made it the young woman sad, bitter, happy, and depressed in short turns. Good-natured as she was, in the end, the old lady told her what she hoped for. Her face turned red with embarrassment, but the old woman went on. You've had children of your own, and of course you know. You certainly know more than I do about it." Then she left. That evening, the Tsutsai also told her all about the family, either to impress her or to flirt with her. She sat by the dresser of red wood and had her eyes fixed on it, because it was something she didn't have in her other house. The Tsutsai sat down from the dresser and asked, "What's your name?" She didn't reply, and without smiling, arose and walked over to the bed. The Tsutsai, following her, asked with a smile, "Are you shy? You must be thinking of your husband, but I'm your husband now." He spoke lightly and took her sleeve. "Cheer up a bit. You're thinking of your child too, aren't you? But—" He didn't finish, but gave a laugh and took off his outer robe. She could hear Tan Yang outside the room cursing someone with a loud voice, though she couldn't tell whom she was cursing, whether it be the cook or herself. Since Tan Yang must resent her, she felt herself to be an object of the curses. The Tsutsai called for the bed. "Come to bed. She's always nagging like this. She used to be very fond of one of the hands, but because he likes to talk to Mrs. Huang in the kitchen, she's always cursing her." The days passed. The memory of her former home faded. Her present life became more familiar to her. Even so, sometimes the sound of Chun Piao's crying echoed in her ears. She dreamed of him several times too, but such dreams became fewer and fewer as her duties increased. She knew the old woman was jealous and suspicious. Outwardly she acted generously, but her jealousy made her behave like a spy, monitoring her husband's every movement and gesture. Sometimes, when the Tsutsai returned home, if he happened to greet the young woman first, he would of course talk to her first. Then the old one would suspect him of giving her something special. That very evening she would call him to her chamber and lecture him harshly. "Are you bewitched by that fox? Go away yourself, you old bag of bones, still acting so shameless at your age." The younger woman had heard words like these on one occasion. After that, whenever she saw the Tsutsai coming home and Tan Yang wasn't sitting next to her, the young woman would hurriedly evade him. Even if she were there, she would still try her best to stay away from him, though she was careful to make her exit as natural as possible so that others would not notice her, for fear that Tan Yang would explode and say that she intentionally humiliated her. After that, she was burdened with more and more of the housework, her position no better than a maid's. But she was a rather clever woman. Sometimes when the old woman changed her clothes, she would wash them for her. Then Tan Yang would say, "Why did you wash my clothes for me? Even your own clothes should have Mrs. Huang wash for you." But almost immediately she would say, "Younger sister, you'd better go out and take a look at the pig pen. Why are those two pigs oinking so? They might still be hungry. Mrs. Huang never feeds them enough." After 8 months, that next winter, her appetite changed. She had no taste for rice, and she wanted fresh noodles or sweet potatoes. But after a few meals, she was tired of these two and wanted wonton dumplings. If she ate too much, she would vomit. In addition, she craved pumpkins and plums, but those wouldn't be in season until the 6th month and were extremely scarce. Where could they be found? The Tsutsai knew what this change meant. He went around with a smile on his face all day. He made an effort to get of whatever was available. He himself went to buy oranges and asked others to bring back tangerines. He would pace back and forth under the veranda, murmuring to himself. When he saw her milling rice for New Year's with Mrs. Huang, he'd tell her to rest before she had gotten even 3 pecks ready. Stop and rest. The hired hand can do it. Everyone wants to eat gluttonous rice cakes. Sometimes in the evening, when others were talking, he'd be off by himself with a lamp reading the Book of Songs. "Quang quang," cried the ospreys on the islet in the river. "The modest, charming young lady is a good match for the gentleman." When the hired hand would ask, "Master, you're not going to sit for any examination. What are you reading that for?" He would stroke his clean-shaven lips and reply with pleasure, "That's right. Do you know what life's pleasures are? Candles lit on the wedding night, success of the imperial exam. You know what that means? These are the happiest moments of one's life. I am right past that, but I have something even better. Everyone except his 2 wives would laugh. The old woman was really annoyed by all of this. At first she was delighted by the news of the pregnancy, but when she saw how the Tsia went to such lengths to please the younger woman, she then loathed her own barrenness. Once in the 3rd month of her 2nd year there, the young woman felt sick and headachy, and slept for 3 days. The Tsia wanted her to rest and often came to see if she needed anything. The old woman was furious. She accused her of pretending to be sick and nagged her about it for 3 days. At first she maliciously ridiculed her, saying she had begun putting on airs the minute she had arrived. Her back was sore or her head hurt, affecting the pose of the real concubine. She said that she didn't believe she'd been so pampered at her own house. Rather, she must have been more like a mangy bitch, belly pregnant with pups. She had still had to scurry around begging for food before giving birth. But now, because that old thing, the name Tan Yang used to refer to her husband, fawned over her, she was acting spoiled. Who hasn't raised a son? She once heard saying in the kitchen to Mrs. Huang, I've been pregnant myself. What's so difficult about it? And besides, right now, that thing in her womb is still in the name in the King of Hell's record book. Who can guarantee that it is a boy and not a scabby toad? Only after the baby worms its way out for me to see can she put on airs in front of me. Right now, it's no more than a bloody hunk. Don't you think that she's acting up a bit too early? That evening, the younger woman had gone to bed without eating supper. When she heard the oblique curses and mockery, she began crying softly. The Tsia, dressed and sitting in the bed, broke into a cold sweat and began to tremble when he heard that Tan Yang had just said. He wanted to fasten his robes and get up again and give Tan Yang a sound beating, grab her by her hair and thrash her to vent his rage. But for some unknown reason, he didn't seem to have the strength. Even his fingers were trembling, his arms limp and sore. He sighed, I've been too good to her. We've been married for 30 years and I never hit her. I've never been so much as grazed her skin with my fingernail. No wonder she's become as difficult as Her Majesty the Empress. Saying this, he crawled over to the young woman's end of the bed, drew close to her side, and whispered in her ear, Don't cry, don't cry. Let her screech. Really, she's like a hen without a womb, so that she can't stand seeing others hatching eggs. If you can give me a son, I'll give you 2 jewels. I have a blue jade ring and a white jade. He didn't finish what he intended to say, as he could no longer bear to hear Tan Yang's mocking laughter reverberate outside his door. He hurriedly disrobed and, slipping under the covers, pressed his head to her breast. I have a white jade. Her belly grew larger day by day to the size of a bushel basket. The old lady finally hired a midwife and openly began making baby clothes from some patterned cloth. June was spent in hope, the hottest month in the lunar calendar when summer neared its end. At the beginning of autumn, cool breezes swept over the village. One day, their hopes reached a climax. The atmosphere in the house became agitated. The sweet Tsai was unusually nervous, pacing back and forth in the courtyard. He held an almanac in his hand, as if he were memorizing it, mumbling over and over the Wu Chen Cha Su, the year of Jianyin. At times he glanced anxiously in the direction of the room with closed windows. This room lay the mother in labor, moaning in a low voice. Then he looked up at the sun obscured by the banks of clouds and walked to the door, asked Mrs. Huang, who was standing at the door, Well, how she's doing? Mrs. Huang gave a silent nod, then after a pause added, Any minute now. Then he again took up his almanac and paced back and forth on the veranda. This went on until dusk. The kitchen smoke rose into the air and lamps lit up the houses like spring flowers bursting into bloom. The child arrived. It was a boy. The child screamed loudly inside the house. Then The Sutsai slumped in a corner, so happy that he almost cried. No one felt like eating dinner. Before the plain dishes on the table, Tan Yang announced to everyone, "Keep it a secret for a while so the little cat won't run into bad luck. Should anyone ask, say it's a girl." They all nodded, smiling contentedly. 1 month later, the child's soft white face shone in the autumn sunlight. The younger woman nursed him while the neighboring women gathered around to look. Some praised his mouth, other praised his ears, still other praised the child's mother, saying that she was stronger than before and her complexion fairer. Tan Yang appeared as protective and doting as a grandmother, saying, "That's enough for now. Don't make him cry." The Sutsai racked his brains to think of a name for the child, but couldn't come up with an appropriate one. The old lady wanted to choose a character from the sayings longevity, wealth, and prominence, or fortune, prosperity, longevity, and happiness. Still, the best was longevity, or a synonym like Qi or Peng Tzu. But the Sutsai wouldn't have it, feeling that they were too vulgar names anyone might choose to use. So he paged through the Book of Changes and the Book of History in search, and half a month passed, then a whole month, and he still hadn't found a suitable name. The name that should bring fortune to the child on one hand and signify his getting a son late in life on another, so it wasn't an easy task. One day, he was holding the 3-month-old child, leafed through his books looking for a name. He wore a pair of glasses and held the book in the lamplight. The child's mother sat woodenly to one side, lost in thought, when she had suddenly blurted out, "I was thinking, wouldn't it be better to call him Chu Piao, Autumn Treasure?" Everyone turned to look at her and listened in silence. Wasn't he born in autumn? Treasure of autumn? Let's call him Chu Piao. That's right. The Sutsai immediately followed up, "I've been trying to think of such a name. I am over half a century old, truly in the autumn of my life." The child was born in autumn. Autumn is the season when everything comes to maturity. Chu Piao is a good name for him. And doesn't the Book of History have it? Then there was autumn. Now I truly have my autumn. Then he praised the child's mother, saying it was really useless being a bookworm like him because intelligence is innate. His praise made the woman feel uncomfortable sitting there. She lowered her head and smiled sadly with tears in her eyes, and thought to herself, "It was only because I was thinking of Chum Piao, my spring treasure." Chu Piao, growing up into a lovely child, wouldn't leave his mother's side. He had unusually large eyes and never tired of gazing at strangers. However, he could immediately recognize his mother from a distance. He clung to her all day long. Although the Sutsai loved him more than she did, he didn't like his father. Tan Yang, on the surface, loved him as if he were her own son, but the child's large eyes gazed at her as if she were a stranger in his odd, untiring way. He clung closer to his mother as the days of her leaving drew near. Spring overtook winter. Summer came close upon the spring, and soon everyone became aware of the fact that the mother's 3-year contract was about to expire. The Sutsai, because he loved the child, first broached the subject with Tan Yang. He wanted to take $100 to buy her outright, but his first wife answered, "If you want to buy her, then poison me first." Then the Sutsai heard that. He was so angry and snorted and couldn't speak for a long time. Later, he forced a smile and said, "Think about the child's not having a mother." The old woman scoffed in a shrill voice, "Oh, I'm not good enough to be his mother?" The child's mother wrestled with her conflicting feelings. On one hand, the thought, 3 years, always went through her mind. 3 years would pass quickly in spite of the fact that she had become like a maid in the Sutsai's household. The Chum Piao of her imagination was lively and lovable as the Chu Piao before her. If she couldn't give Chu Piao up, how could she give up Chum Piao either? But on the other hand, she really wanted to stay in this new home forever. She figured that Chum Piao's father probably wouldn't live very long because of his illness. He would probably live 3 to 5 more years. In that time, she could beg for her second husband to let Chum Piao come stay with her. Then Chum Piao could be with her. Once she sat on the bench in the corridor, crumpled with fatigue. The rays of early summer sun, it was easy for her mind to wander. Chu Piao slept in her arms, still sucking her nipple, but she felt as if Chum Piao were also standing by her side. She reached out her hand to embrace Chum Piao, and at the same time wanting to speak to her two sons, but there was nothing there. Instead, in the doorway, farther down the hall, stood the old woman, with her malevolent face and fiendish eyes, her gaze immediately fixed on the younger woman. Immediately wakened from her reverie with a start, I think I'd better leave this place as soon as possible. She watches over me like a spy. But no sooner had the child in her arms started to cry when she was brought back to the reality before her eyes. Sometime later, the Sutsai modified his plan. He wanted to call old Granny Shen over and have her talk to the young woman's husband and ask if he'd be willing to accept $30, at the most $50, to renew the contract for another 3 years. He reasoned with Tan Yang. When Chu Piao reaches 5, he could then be separated from his mother. Tan Yang was saying her Buddhist rosary. Thus, amid the Amitabha Buddha incantations, she answered, "Her first child is still at home. You ought to let her be reunited with her first husband a while." The Sutsai, lowering his head, mumbled incoherently, "Just think, when Chu Piao is only 2 years old, he will have lost his mother." This time the old woman put her beads aside and said, "I can raise him. I can take care of him. Are you afraid I'll harm him?" When he heard the last sentence, the Sutsais hurriedly departed. But the old woman would not stop and kept on saying, "This son was born for my sake. Chu Piao is mine. I didn't have any children. That cuts off your family line, but I will still eat at your family table. You've really become bewitched. You're muddled in your own age, for you can't think straight at all. How many years more do you think you can live? So why drag her around by your side? Place her spirit tablet beside mine in the ancestral temple? No way." The old woman had more venomous remarks for him to hear, but the Sutsai hurried out of earshot. That summer, a boil appeared on the child's head, and sometimes he had a slight fever. The old woman prayed to Buddha constantly and tried to obtain some Buddhist medicine to put on the boil or force down his throat. The child's mother didn't think it was urgent and didn't want to upset him and make him cry himself into a sweat. Once she had no sooner secretly disposed of the medicine he barely touched than the old woman was heard to sigh audibly and complain to the Sutsai, "Just look at her. She doesn't care one bit about the child's sickness. She even says he hasn't gotten any thinner. Love is in the heart. The deepest love for appearance's sake is only false." The young woman could only keep her tears to herself. The Sutsai remained silent. On Chu Piao's first birthday, the family celebrated with a noisy all-day banquet. 30 or 40 guests came. Some gave presents of clothing, others birthday noodles or lions made of silver bullion to hang around his neck. Still others gave the child gold-plated god of longevity to pin on his cap. The guests brought their presents tucked into their sleeves. They came with the best wishes for the child's future success and long life. The host was radiant with joy, as if his cheeks reflected the glowing clouds at sunset. But on precisely that day, just when they were beginning the evening banquet at dusk, a guest arrived. He came out of the fading sunlight and walked toward them in the courtyard. Everyone fixed his gaze on them, a gaunt and haggard man from the country, unshaven and with patched clothes. He had a package tucked under his arm. The host, startled, went to greet him, asking where he was from. He answered haltingly, as if he had a lisp. The host was perplexed for a moment, then understood. He was the fur trader. The host said softly, "But why did you bring a present? There's no need to do that." The guest, looking about timidly, "Of course I should. I come to wish the baby a long life." His voice trailed off. He took the parcel from under his arm and opened it. With trembling hands, he unwrapped 2 or 3 layers of paper and took out a 4-inch square-plated brass letters, "Longevity comparable to the southern mountains." Tan Yang went over, eyeing him carefully with an air of disapproval, but the Tsutsai ushered him to a table as guests whispered amongst themselves. After 2 hours of meat and wine, the guests became reckless and impetuous. They played the finger-guessing game, shouting at the top of their lungs and shoving a large bowl of wine back and forth to punish the loser by making him take a drink. Their clamor nearly toppled the house over. The fur trader, though he had drunk 2 cups of wine, was the only one who remained in his place. The others didn't invite him to join him. Their enthusiasm waning, the guests hurriedly wolfed down a bowl of rice and, having exchanged pleasantries, faded off by 2s and 3s out of the lantern light. The fur trader continued to eat until the servants came to clear the table. Then he retreated to the dark corner of the veranda, where he came across his pawned wife. "What did you come here for?" the woman asked pathetically. "Why would I want to come? I had no choice." "Then why did you come so late?" "Just where do you think I got the money for the present? It took all morning running here and to beg for a loan. Then I had to go into town to buy the gift. I got so tired and hungry, so I came here late." The woman changed the subject and asked, "Where's Champiao?" The man hesitated, then replied, "It's because of him that I've come." "Because of him?" The woman echoed in alarm. The man slowly explained, "Ever since summer, Champiao's getting very thin, and he got sick in the fall. Where could I get the money to take him to a doctor and buy him medicine? Now he's really sick. If we don't do something for him, he'll surely die." After a moment of silence, he continued, "I've come to borrow some money from you." The pain was like having cats clawing at her heart, ripping it apart and devouring it. She wanted to cry, but she didn't dare, because it was the occasion when others had come to celebrate Chu Piao's birthday. She held back tears and said to her husband, "Where would I get any money? They only give me 20 cents a month for pocket money. Since I have no need for it, I spend it on the child. So what can we do?" They fell silent. Then the woman asked, "Who's taking care of Champiao now?" "A neighbor. I want to go home tonight. I'd better be going." He wiped away his tears as he spoke. The woman said, sobbing, "Wait a minute. I'll see if I can borrow money from him." She walked off. 3 evenings later, the Tsutsai suddenly asked her, "What happened to that blue jade ring I gave you?" "I gave it to him that night. He pawned it." "Didn't I lend you $5? The Tsutsai retorted angrily. The woman, hanging her head, paused, then answered, $5 wouldn't have been enough." The Tsutsai sighed. "No matter how good I am to you, you're always more attached to your former husband and son. I originally wanted to keep you for another 2 years, but now I think you better leave next spring." The woman was so shocked that she couldn't even cry. Several days later, he spoke for her. "That ring was an heirloom I wanted you to pass on to Chu Piao. Who'd have thought you'd immediately take it out and pawn it? It's lucky she doesn't know, or she'd carry on for 3 months." The woman became thinner and more shallow by the day. Her listless eyes stared blankly ahead of her, and her ears rang with mockery and abuse. She often thought about Chun Piao's illness. She tried to find out if any friends were coming through from her hometown, or if there was any passerby going in that direction. She hoped to hear news that Chun Piao had regained his health, but she heard nothing. She wanted to borrow $2 and buy some candy to send there, but there weren't any travelers going there. She often stood along the road near the main gate, holding Chu Piao in her arms, looking down the road where people would be coming or going toward her hometown. This made Tan Yang very uncomfortable, and she often reminded the Tsutsai, "She doesn't want to stay here. She can hardly wait to run home." For several nights she suddenly cried out in her sleep, holding Chu Piao. Chu Piao was frightened and began to cry. The Tsutsai questioned her closely. "What's the matter with you? What is it?" She made no answer, only hummed and patted Chu Piao. Then the Tsutsai continued, "Did you dream that your other son died, so you cried out? You even woke me up." The woman immediately said, No, but there seemed to be a grave mound in front of me." The Tsutsai was silent. The sad image once more floated before her eyes. She was approaching a grave. At the end of winter, the birds announcing the spring and hastening her departure were already chirping under her window. First the child was weaned, and then the Taoist priest came to say a service to ensure the child's safety through this critical situation. Thus the eternal separation of the child and his real mother was decided once and for all. That day, Mrs. Huang privately asked the first wife, "Shall I call the sedan carriers to take her home?" The first wife, saying her Buddhist rosary, replied, "Let her walk. The fee would have to be paid when she arrived there. Where would she get the money? I hear her own husband doesn't even have any rice to eat. She needn't act like she's rich. It's not too far. I've walked 30 or 40 li myself, and her feet are bigger than mine. She can make it in half a day." That morning when she dressed Chu Piao, tears streamed down her face, and the little child crawled out to her, "Auntie, auntie." The old woman wanted him to call her mother, so she only permitted him to call the younger woman auntie. She answered him in a choked voice. She wished to say something to him, like, "I'm leaving you, my dear son. Your mother will be nice to you. You want to be nice to her too when you grow up. Don't think of me anymore." But she couldn't say the words. She knew, of course, that a child 1.5 years old wouldn't understand. The Sutsai quietly approached her from behind and slipped 2 strings of cash under her arm, saying in a low voice, "Here's $2. Take it with you." The woman buttoned up the child's clothes and stuffed the money in an inside breast pocket. The old woman entered the room. When she saw Sutsai leave it, she told the woman, "Let me hold Chu Piao, or else she'll cry when you leave." The woman didn't answer, but Chu Piao wasn't letting the old woman hold him. He struck her over and over in the face. Finally, in anger, she blurted out, "All right then, go eat breakfast with him. Give him to me when you're finished." Mrs. Huang pressed her to eat more, saying, "You've been this way for half a month now. You're thinner now than when you came. You ought to go take a look in the mirror. Today you better eat a whole bowl. You still have to walk 30 li." She replied indifferently, "You're really nice to me." The sun was already high and the weather was good, but Chu Piao didn't leave her side. The old woman brutally snatched him out of her arms. Chu Piao kicked her in the stomach with his tiny feet, scratched at her head with his tiny hands, and screamed at the top of his voice. The woman standing behind them said, "Let me wait until after lunch." The old woman turned around and replied coldly, "Pack your things and be off with you. You'll have to leave sooner or later anyway." She gradually walked out of the range of the child's screams. While she packed her things, her ears rang with the sound of her child's crying. Mrs. Huang stood off to one side, comforting her and watching what she was putting in her pack. She finally tucked the old bundle under her arm and left. When she went out the main gate, she could hear Chu Piao's cries. After she had slowly walked 3 li, she could still hear him crying. The road, bright in the warm sun, stretched out before her, as endless as the sky. When she reached the river, she wanted to stop all her weary steps in life by throwing herself into the clear, mirror-like waters. However, after resting a while on the riverbank, she continued on her way, moving her shadow along. The sun had already passed the meridian where an old farmer in one of the villages told her she still had 15 li to go. She told him, "Uncle, please call a sedan chair for me. I can't walk any farther." "Are you sick?" the old man asked. "Yes." She sat in the roadside pavilion at the entrance to the village. "Where are you from?" The woman paused and then replied, "I'm going there. This morning I thought I could walk there myself." The old man, pitying her, didn't ask anything more, but found 2 sedan carriers for her. The sedan chair didn't have a cover, as it was spring planting time. At about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the coverless sedan chair passed into the narrow, dirty little village lane. Sprawled in the sedan chair was a middle-aged woman with a withered face, the color of dried and yellowing vegetable leaf. Her sunken, dispirited eyes were closed. Her breaths came faintly. A passerby stared at her with pitying looks. A gang of children chased after the sedan chair, as if some rare occurrence had happened in the isolated little village. Chumpiao was one of the children following behind in the sedan chair. He raced after it, shouting as if herding pigs. Once the chair had turned the corner, continuing in the direction of his house, he stuck his hands out in amazement. The sedan chair arrived at the door to his house. He froze in his place and stared at it from afar. He leaned against the pillar and smiled at the sedan chair. The other children timidly circled it. The woman got out. Her dazed eyes didn't at first recognize that the 7-year-old child before her, wearing ragged clothes with tousled hair, the same size as 3 years ago, was her Chumpiao. Suddenly she cried out in a loud voice, "Chumpiao!" The children all started involuntarily. Chumpiao was so frightened he ducked into the house where his father was. The woman sat in the dim house for a long time. She and her husband didn't exchange a word. Night fell. He raised his head to her and said, "Make dinner." The woman had no choice but to get up. She looked slowly around the corner, listlessly replying to her husband, "The rice jar is empty." The man laughed bitterly. "You act as if you're still living in the gentry. The rice is kept in that cigarette box over there." That evening, the man said to his son, "Chumpiao, go sleep with your mother." But Chumpiao stood by the stove and cried. His mother approached him, saying, "Chumpiao, my precious." But when she reached out to him, he dodged away from her. The father then said, "You've forgotten your mother so quickly, I'll beat the daylights out of you." She lay on a filthy narrow bed, eyes wide open. Chumpiao, like a stranger, lay sleeping beside her. In her dull, numb mind, it was as if her lovable Chumpiao, plump and fair, were restlessly tossing and turning by her side. She reached out to hold him, but it was Chumpiao who was beside her. Chumpiao had already fallen asleep. She turned over and held him close to her. The child, breathing evenly, his face buried in her bosom, reached out to stroke her breast. The long night, silent and cold as death, seemed to drag on endlessly.